back to the Climate Economics Podcast. Today is the second part of my conversation with Richard Tol. And in the first part of the conversation, we focused on what are integrated assessment models and the structure of the model Richard Tol developed. And we discussed what these models are trying to do, why adaptation matters for these models, and why climate damages depend not only on warming itself, but also on other things like the development level, institutions, public goods, and technological change. In this episode, however, we move from model structure to model use. And we talk about the social cost of carbon, how the Obama-era EPA worked with models like FUND, and we'll get some insights from Richard on how that went about. And so in the second part, we are going to discuss what happens when integrated assessment models leave the seminar room and enter the policy process. And we talk about the social cost of carbon, how the Obama-era EPA worked with models like FUND, and we'll get some insights from Richard on how that went about. Why single headline numbers can be both useful and misleading, why misunderstood models can be dangerous, and what the debate around integrated assessment models reveals about kind of the boundary between economics and climate politics. And if you haven't listened to part one, I'd recommend starting there, because that episode unpacks kind of the logic of the model itself, but you can also jump in here if you want to. So with that said, let's continue the conversation. I started the introduction with this. When you get to the social cost of carbon, like under the Obama administration, they kind of used three models. They used the DICE, the PAGE, and then the FUND model. How did you view that process then by the Obama administration's interagency working group? Because you said, there shouldn't be a single estimate, but I do get the sense that as a policymaker, ultimately you need like a number to put on the carbon tax.
Yes, no, absolutely. And it is indeed right and proper that the EPA does such a process of filtering and then coming out with a single advice, right? That is their job. That is not our job. It would be entirely wrong for me as a professor to narrow the range to a single number. That is the job for policy advisors, not policy analysts. The experience with the EPA was actually very interesting. And I was not involved in the decision making at all, right? That was what we did. Essentially what the EPA did was they spent 2 years understanding these three integrated assessment models and running them. And that tells you something about how the EPA was then, right?
Yeah, they took 2 years to understand.
And they took 2 years not to learn how to run the model, because that actually doesn't take 2 years. Because depending on which version you use, it's typically a single command, right, to run the model. What they spent those 2 years on was essentially for a team of analysts in the EPA, fully understanding the model, every parameter, and understanding it to such a degree that they could explain it to their political bosses, right? And that was a very enriching experience, because the EPA hires exclusively PhDs from top programs. So working with people who are trying to understand your work, who are really, really clever and devote a lot of time to understanding this, is actually a very enriching experience. And then after that, they fully understood what they were doing, to the extent that a number of them were actually contributing to the literature on the social cost of carbon and climate economics more generally. And then they took it and ran it through the political process. And that was something that I had no influence over whatsoever, right? And they were actually not interested in my opinions at all on that. One of the debates we had was, and it actually came back to bite them, I think was, what is the social cost of carbon for the United States? Is it the impacts that fall on the United States? It's under the jurisdiction of the United States. Or do you acknowledge a certain degree of liability for the impacts that you cause outside of the United States? We had long debates about that. And essentially, at the end, it was the politicians and the lawyers who decided to do that. And they never presented sort of like the social cost of carbon for the US only. And of course, that's the very first thing that Trump did. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So I actually had a solo episode in episode 6 where I kind of discussed the Obama to Trump with the few tweaks that Trump did was exactly just look at US estimates and change the discount rate and then vastly reduced it.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, and maybe I'll here do a quote from your website, because I think it's a really interesting quote you have from the Fund Model website. So it goes as follows. It is a developer's firm belief that most researchers should be locked away in an ivory tower. Models are often quite useless in unexperienced hands and sometimes misleading. No one is smart enough to master in a short period what took someone else years to develop. Not understood models are irrelevant, half understood models treacherous, and misunderstood models dangerous. So in that sense, it actually sounds like EPA, in your view, took a good course where the policy analysts took 2 years to understand the models. But that did make me wonder, what do you think are the most misunderstood aspects of the fund model, and how have you seen that potentially translated into wrong uses?
So that quote does not refer back to the EPA.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. I mean, that was a very enriching experience. That quote reflects my general understanding of my fellow academics, right, who are safely locked up. I think most of them. There's two things I want to say about this. One is the Edmonds strategy, as I call it.
The what? The
Edmonds strategy. So
the admin. Okay. Yeah.
Is a prominent figure in integrated assessment modeling. Has been involved with advising on environmental and energy policy for 40 years or longer, right? And one thing that Edmonds used to do when he was presenting his results from his various integrated assessment models was say such things as, yes, we can meet this target if we scale up nuclear by so and so much, if we build 400 nuclear power plants in the next 20 years, which is an outcome of his model. And there were two reactions in the room whenever he said that. So the people who understood nuclear power were falling over laughing, right, about the idea of building 400 nuclear power plants when in 20 years time, when we only have 200 or so that we built over the last 40 years. This is no way this is feasible in any realistic sense of the word, that we would expand nuclear power so fast, right? So Edmonds gave the right advice, right? If we could do this, if we could expand nuclear power really, really fast, we could make a serious dent in CO2 emissions. And that was a technically correct statement. But of course, everybody, or half of the room, half of the room that was falling over laughing, knew that his premise was wrong, right? But at the same time, the other half of the room heard Edmonds say, we can do this, right? And walked away with entirely the wrong message, that these very stringent greenhouse gas emission reduction targets are actually economically and technically feasible. That is strictly not what he said, right? But half of the room understood it like that and continued to give him research money to keep on working on his model and keep on hiring research assistants. So that is what I mean when I say if you don't understand the model, you can walk away with entirely the wrong conclusion. And some people use that as a strategy, right? Now, the other episode that this particular remark refers to is Ackerman, who took our model, changed it, found results that are completely ridiculous, and then blamed us. And particularly, what Ackerman claimed that we did in the model was that we divided by zero, which
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
is not something that you should do. And actually, if you try and do that in numerical code, it sort of like doesn't work.
No.
Now, Ackerman was particularly dishonest because we explained it to him many times that we did not divide by zero, and that there was no reason to believe that we did, that we had all sorts of checks in the model before the final result emerged, that even if we had tried to divide by zero, we would have caught this, or by approximately zero. But he published the result nonetheless, right?
So after telling him, as I understand it, that this was not something your model did, you had many checks before it ever got there.
Mm-hmm.
This was a multiple conversation. He still then published results that that's what you did.
Yes.
Okay.
Which of course serves a political agenda in his case, namely to go after one of the three major trade assessment models for cost benefit analysis at that time, right? So I mean, we learned lessons from that, right? And one of the lessons that we learned was not to put the codes just on the web, but now it's all on GitHub with version control and everything. So you can't just take our model and change it and then claim that we made a mistake. Now we can actually show that you made a mistake, which we couldn't at that time, right? Because we did not have version control. And yeah, I mean, this was not a pleasant experience, as you can imagine, because Ackerman was reasonably prominent in certain circles. A lot of people believed him. A lot of people wanted to believe him, right? But yeah, it's just complete nonsense.
Yeah. Okay, but then I think that helps to kind of frame that quote, which and because another thing is just you have a few of these quotes that are really wanted to get to is and we'll get back to something else too. Is another quote you have is about like that climate estimates are never, for some it's too low and then for some it's too high. Because you say an integrated assessment model fund is used to advise policymakers about proper, not so proper strategies. The model, however, always reflects its developers' world's views. It is therefore regularly contrary to the rhetoric of politicians and occasionally politically incorrect. Climate models can go against the rhetoric of politicians on both sides. On one side, they actually predict damages, which, clear there. For the other side, estimated damages might not be high enough. Because I thought this was really interesting because I once saw there's this economist professor, I don't know his, but he like went on several podcasts saying that Bill Nordhaus is like climate's worst enemy because the damages from the dice model weren't big enough, or like he was using some wrong thing. So I was wondering, as one of the authors of one of these leading integrated assessment models, have you like seen this tension too, or has this manifested for you as well?
No, absolutely. And the guy you're talking about is Steve Keen, right?
Yeah.
So going back to Nordhaus, right? Nordhaus worked in the Carter White House, and Nordhaus was one of the architects of the early investments in renewables. I mean, Carter had this big stunt that he put solar panels on the White House, right?
Yeah.
It's ridiculous because they were very expensive and did not deliver much electricity. But another thing that Carter did was start the program of research into renewables that is now paying off big time, right? Had that not been started back in the 70s, we would not be in the position where we are now. And Nordhaus was actually one of the architects of this. Throughout his career, Nordhaus has always advocated for climate policy, has always advocated for more stringent, or almost always advocated for more stringent climate policy than what politicians did in the United States, for sure. Including the Clinton-Gore administration, right? Nordhaus was far to the green side of Clinton and Gore, right? Gore, of course, after he lost power, started making all sorts of noise about what we should be doing. But while he was in power, he did very, very little about climate policy. Nordhaus was also, with his brother, he helped design the emissions trading scheme for sulfur, right? Which was sort of the blueprint for the emissions trading schemes for carbon dioxide and now other greenhouse gases in Europe, right? And the two Nordhauses, or two of the three Nordhauses, were behind this, right? Nordhaus also was the one who helped decide Bush the Elder to sign the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. During the Rio negotiations, the DICE model was running in the background to see whether the US could afford to sign up to this, yes or no. And with confidence building by one of the most prominent macroeconomists in the United States, I doubt that Bush would have signed the UNFCCC. So the idea that Nordhaus is the enemy of climate policy is historical revisionism on an epic scale. It's just people who do not understand how things really work, right? And what he really did. People who just have not studied his career and the things that he's done. And, one of the most important things in climate policy is that sort of the big investors have confidence in climate policy and they listen to somebody who is a professor of economics at Yale much more than somebody who is a half-baked macroeconomist on podcasts, right? A lot of what Steve Keen says comes out of the frustration of 40 years being ignored basically by his fellow economists. And now he's essentially yelling that I am the genius and you guys don't know what you're doing. Yeah, we've ignored you for 40 years because most of what you're doing is not very good. So that sort of explains the tone and his frustration, but the captains of industry listen to Nordhaus and not to Keen, right? Simple as that. A lot of that Nordhaus has drawn a lot of that fire, right? But he has played it more fairly clever because he essentially does not engage, right? He just is aloof, right? He writes papers. He rarely writes op-eds or gives interviews or things like that. Definitely doesn't do social media. Now I do these things, as you know. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. And so I draw a lot of fire as well, right? From mostly from Greens, who also think that I'm the devil. Because also, Nordhaus has advocated for a carbon tax since 1975, I only since 1992. But that's because he's a lot older than I am, right? I have advocated for climate policy since the start of my career, essentially. So the idea that I would be against this is just a bit ridiculous. My recommendations for a carbon tax have always been above the actual carbon tax, except in Europe, where I'm sort of saying, the price of CO2 emission permits is roughly correct. In the rest of the world, the price is too low, is what I've basically said for the last 35 years. as you noticed earlier, I helped formulate the Obama climate policy and the Biden climate policy, and actually also the Trump climate policy. Trump wanted to set the social cost of carbon to zero. But then the courts in Delaware stepped in and said, no, these estimates of the social cost of carbon are sufficiently robust that you cannot go to zero. So that is something that not just me, it was Nordhaus and Chris Hope as well, right? Our work was apparently good enough to withstand the onslaught in the court. I also helped formulate the carbon tax in Ireland when I was there.
Okay.
I helped formulate the landfill tax that we see in the United Kingdom at the moment. So the idea that I am sort of against climate policy is just nuts. The idea that I stopped or hindered climate policy is just, you guys just don't know the facts, right? Just pay attention. And I mean, my credentials here are, of course, much less impressive than Nordhaus, because I mean, helping formulate the carbon tax in Ireland is not as impressive as doing that or helping establish the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but still.
Any carbon tax implementation.
At the same time, people who think that there should be that climate change is a hoax or invented by the Chinese or the Russians or whatever don't like me either, because I think that climate change is real, caused by humans, a problem that should be solved.
Thanks for that. And I want to also, I think I want to add something to that, because it was one of your blog posts, and I found it interesting, because it's like you say, some of that you draw fire, but you quote the following on your Substack on the post called Economic Impact of Climate Change, called, "Many people express skepticism at the economic impact functions used in integrated assessment models for cost-benefit analysis.
Mm-hmm.
The modest impacts for high warming draw particular ire. This is a red herring. The assumed impacts are sufficiently large to justify greenhouse gas reductions to keep temperatures well below 3 degrees Celsius of warming. The assumptions about what would happen at 4 degrees may be spectacularly wrong, but they do not influence the model results." Because I think that's sometimes also that they're like, oh, these aren't big enough, but I think it's like you say, you support climate policy because the assumed impacts are sufficiently large to justify the reductions. So
let's get a little bit technical here, right? So you can just, and this is the key theme. So what matters really for an optimizing model like DICE is the value function, right? Not the utility function. What matters is what you do in the optimal scenario. And in the DICE model, temperatures rarely get above 3.5 degrees. And it's a model that runs without uncertainty. So really, it is irrelevant, right? You can sort of make the impact function extra steep after 4 degrees. You can multiply everything by 10 or 100. It does not affect the result because the model never goes there, right? And what unsuspecting people who are not mathematically trained, if they look at the model and the equations and the parameterizations, they look at the objective function essentially rather than at the value function. And they just get it wrong. And that is just a matter of patiently explaining to them how these models work, right? Steve Keen is a trained macroeconomist. He knows the difference between a value function and an objective function. And he has been told that the two are different. He's been looking at the wrong results, right? And that is particularly bad that he knows what he says is not true, right? But for people who are not, who do not have a PhD in economics, I understand the confusion. I understand that you sort of like look at these functions and you think this just can't be right. The problem, of course, is that there's actually very little literature about what would be the impacts of climate change for 4 degrees or for 8 degrees of warming. Essentially, most studies have focused on fairly modest warming, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, not even much on 4 degrees, typically 2 or 3 degrees. So that is your calibration point. And then what happens after that is essentially extrapolate. And, very little about this. So yeah. But fortunately what we find is that if we make these assumptions, then we recommend a carbon tax that would ensure that we just don't go to these places where we know very little about, which is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what a world of 4 degrees would look like. It seems very scary.
I think so too. Then maybe, because I want to also be respectful, because I do have a question about cost benefit analysis. It's just, you make, by the way, I have to say, I've really enjoyed your writing. I feel like, I didn't know you before, I just knew you from a fund model, but I've been like also reading some of your papers, your blog posts. I also will just say I have really appreciated the style in which you write. It's so, and one of your posts is on the role of cost benefit analysis. And I want to get to EU climate policy here just for a second, because there it's like quantity targeting, which I'm, you could almost say, United States strain by Michael Greenstone. So I've always been thinking about the social cost of carbon and then cost benefit analysis. So you wrote the following: cost benefit analysis, quote, cost benefit analysis has been used to propose a target for greenhouse gas emission reduction. This inevitably starts a brawl because cost benefit analysis forces you to make explicit all assumptions and value judgments that imply said target. There are other less abrasive ways to set targets, but those can be reverse engineered to reveal the implicit assumptions that make them optimal in the sense of cost benefit analysis. I think it's better to be upfront about your assumptions. I think it's better to be upfront about your assumptions and values. Cost benefit analysis is a good way to get published in the economics journal. It is less suitable for climate policy advice.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to touch upon this because when I hear EU climate policy, it's always these quantity targets like net zero, the cap and trade is a quantity set. But then I was always like surprised that there's like no discussion on the social cost of carbon. It's like implicit in the background. So that's how I just kind of was wondering that, you wrote this, and I would kind of agree that it's better to be upfront about the value judgments and assumptions. But just wanted to see if you've got, additions to the comment about cost benefit analysis and why you actually think it's good for economics, but then maybe less suitable for climate advice.
I mean, if you want to be an academic, you should be honest, right? If you want to be a politician, you should not be, right? That's just not how you build coalitions, and that is mostly. I mean, there's an inevitable conflict between them. The reason that the EU went for cap and trade rather than a carbon tax is not because they did not want a carbon tax, and not because the policy analysts in the Commission did not understand the differences between the two. And actually they came from Harvard and MIT, and they were very well aware of Marty Weitzman's work that showed that a carbon tax really is superior to cap and trade. The reason that they went for cap and trade was essentially to do with the prospect of tax harmonization in the EU. Essentially, they knew the advantages, the analytical advantages, the theoretical advantages of carbon tax over cap and trade. Also because then you can just tie it to the social cost of carbon if you want. But the English and the Irish basically said, no, there will not be a European tax. And then the next best alternative is cap and trade. And then you immediately get into what should the target be, right? So that explains why the EU went there and Europe went there, and then other countries started copying this because they sort of had a successful example, right? Similarly, in the United States, taxes are taboo, right? Cap and trade has shown to work, right, for sulfur. So also there, people lean towards this. Also because environmentalists like the idea of sort of like capping the maximum amount of pollution that can be emitted, the maximum amount of emissions. So it's much more political than analytical or economic that we went there, right? And in principle, I mean, it is not a terrible policy, right? I mean, you can quibble about things, but the alternative would be much worse than cap and trade. Then the targets that politicians have set in Europe are just very stringent, right? And again, this is politics, right? So the political thing here is that you promise to do a lot long after you have left office while doing little in office, right? That has essentially been the strategy of European politicians, right? And that is why we have targets for 2050. So 2050 is still, what is it? 4 or 5 elections away, right?
Yeah.
So it's not my target, right? And what we now see happening in Europe is that politicians are beginning to backtrack, right? Not about 2050, which is still far, far away, but about current climate policy. People are now beginning to realize that this is expensive. And perhaps we should relax the targets in the short run. Not in the long run, because that doesn't matter anyway, but in the short run, targets are now being relaxed across Europe, right?
Okay, thanks. And then
It actually goes back to cost benefit analysis. This is it's not free, right? So you need to take both into account.
Exactly, because I even read it. So this might just be a random side note, but I once read some in a policy book here on EU climate policy that the social cost of carbon had been discredited among how would I say, was discredited among political circles, and I never knew what they meant, because I don't, maybe I'm not in those circles, but have you heard things that the social cost of carbon has been discredited on EU level? Or
Well, no, they never liked it because it wasn't high enough to justify the target. So the EU is obliged to do cost benefit analysis of any major policy initiative, including climate policy. But if you look at the cost benefit analyses published by the European Commission on climate policy, they're never quite cost benefit analyses.
they what today?
They're never quite cost benefit analyses.
Okay, yeah.
Read in a textbook how you should do a cost benefit analysis. They always fuck numbers because they know that they can't justify the long-term target. The short-term is most. The author of first cost benefit analysis by the European Commission is actually an old friend of mine. And he told me, I'm doing it wrong. That's what the political masters have told me to do.
Yeah.
And it's been like that since.
Got it. Okay. Then, well, thanks for that. Because, it was a little confusing to me, it's just, I think it was, coming from the US and there's disadvantages there because you get these very big fluctuations in US policy. It's like one president comes in, drops by from like 50 to $2. So not saying that that's the ideal system, because then you just get these, more giant fluctuations. I think cap and trade is a little bit more,
Yeah.
stable in the short run, like, with some.
Yeah.
I was wondering, has there anything, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned a lot. Has there anything we haven't touched upon that you would like to add, um, or want to compliment?
No, I think, let me go back to your questions that I was actually had intended to reread before. We talked about the fund model,
Yeah.
extensively. We talked about, yeah, no, we seem to have covered most of what you had intended to cover. Um, and I can't
Yeah.
think of much.
Because I think we also covered I think the only thing that we haven't really covered is the frontier, or like what you're working on now. I mean, you're working definitely on the meta-analysis. It sounds like taking a lot of your time and still writing a lot of papers. So
But there's two things I'm working on at the moment. One going, and I'm a big fan of Schelling. One is trying to quantify the income transfers implied by climate change. And we have a paper doing that at a national level. And it's a bit different than what people think. A lot of people think that the income transfer implied by climate change is really an income transfer from rich to poor, from poor to rich.
yeah.
Right? So the rich emit all the emissions, and the poor suffer all the consequences. That is actually not true.
Okay.
Because the emission intensity in middle income countries is actually much higher than in rich countries. So rich people actually, relative to their income, don't emit that much. And they're also not very vulnerable to climate change. And as a result, it's actually an income transfer from from the poor to the middle income,
Oh, I see.
more than to the rich. So that is one thing. That paper is as good as done. We're doing the same for income classes, and we're doing the same for ethnicities, where you sort of like see very similar things. And the ethnicities things is something that I'm particularly excited about. So that is one thing I'm working on, and the other thing that I'm working on is endogenizing population growth in these models, and particularly working on the welfare aspects of this. So the standard assumption in most of economics, applied economics, is that social welfare is proportional to the number of people times average utility. That's sort of the Bentham view of ethics, right? Which in the case of climate change can lead to very peculiar results. Because if climate change slows down economic growth, and there's good reason to believe that it does, and if you slow down economic growth, you also slow down the demographic transition.
Yeah.
So that means that climate change means that implies that climate change means that more babies will be born in the future. And in a Benthamite model of the world, then it's actually a good thing, because Bentham says the more the merrier. And if you just stick those two assumptions in, then we should actually be subsidizing CO2 emissions, because that means more babies.
Yeah.
If you then throw in sort of the mortality effects of climate change, that completely reverses, you flip the sign, and actually you get a Bressler-like result, that social cost of carbon should be multiplied by 10 or 100. But then if you recalibrate the model, switch perhaps to a less Benthamite, a more Millesian type of welfare function. Or you introduce such things as a life worth living, the Blackerby type of approach to social welfare. Then that particular result disappears as well.
Okay.
Actually, this will be an intellectually interesting paper that I'm putting together, but numerically very disappointing, because at the end of the day, all these effects cancel, and
Okay.
I'm back to the Nordhaus result.
Yeah. Okay.
So I've 4 or 5 moving parts in this paper that are interesting, and then trying to calibrate the parameters, and then at the end of the day, everything cancels.
That's great. Yeah.
And that sort of precludes the sort of the top journals like Nature and
Yeah.
Science, right? When you say, well, I made a much fancier model and the result is the same. They don't like that, but it would be more interesting for an economic journal. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
So those are the things I'm currently working on in the climate space.
Cool. Awesome. Then, well, thank you so much for
Mm-hmm.
taking the time, Rich. I really enjoyed it.
Yep.
One of the goals is for me is to really understand more about the fund model and the history and the insights and the choices. So I've definitely gotten that, and you know, I hope that's also gonna like help other economists like get more of the history and where the choices were made. I feel like getting the researcher to talk about the history and the implications just brings it so much more to life than just reading an academic paper. So I
Well,
think
absolutely. And we can say things that we could never write in a paper, right?
exactly. So thank you so much. I think Lee will definitely help with that. So